Welcome to the Writer's Block, a short web series where we discuss writing, tips for writers, specifically for Fordham University, but really for writers anywhere. And today, oh my God, Peter, it is December and we're almost to the end of the semester,
We are going to
which
make it.
means we have to finish papers. And finishing papers is like this really weird art in and of itself. It's generally that moment where you have like a final read through. You've written this whole thing probably overnight, because if you're an undergrad listening to this, that's how I wrote all my papers, was overnight
Guilty.
reading it the next morning. And ideally, we would, as professors, we would rather have students write papers over the course of several days. But even if you write it over several days, you still do this one final check through. So I'd like to go over, both of us, we've got 3 points each of how we finish papers or what we think is really, really useful.
Yeah, great. Do you want me to begin?
Why don't I give it a start, because I know that one of ours overlaps.
Yep.
And so my first bit of, revision or final check is I stop, I kind of put down my pen. I'm like, well, what was all of that about? You've had like the surge of energy, or maybe you've dragged it out for a few hours. You finally finish your conclusion, and you just stop and you're like, well, what was this all about? And I find that when I'm faced with that question, I have to think back to key terms. Now, oftentimes I'll use key terms in my introduction, but as I continued on through the paper, I might have dropped them or just assumed that the reader knew that when I was saying this, I was referring to this term. And that's not always the case, especially if someone's reading or skimming through a bunch of different essays at the same time. So what I like to do is go ahead and underline all of my key terms or highlight them, and make sure that at least one of the key terms for my paragraph for my introductory paragraphs is in every paragraph in my paper, so that the reader, no matter where they are in my paper, will know how it relates to the main topic. It's also a
That's a
great
that's
way.
a Oh, sorry. I was gonna say that's a great tip. I'm gonna steal this for my next paper and make sure that I'm doing that when I'm writing.
Yeah, it's just consistency of language, because we can say the same thing so many different ways. But while that's understood to us, while you can like finish a paper and think deeply about it, that's not the easiest way to present the information to the reader. And because your professor or the person looking at your application for something is going to be going through a lot of things, you might as well make it easy for them so they remember yours.
Agreed.
All right. My second tip is a little bit more about the general structure of a paper. So I don't know about you, but I never really write a full thing in one go. I write little sections of things. And these little sections of things always contain some argument and some bit of research and some bit of teaching, and like summary and things like that. And while that's really, really good because it helps me like understand small bits of information, it doesn't help the reader. So what I like to do is make sure, after I've written all these bits, that the teaching moments go in a teaching area, the summary moments go in a summary area, and the argument moments go in an argument area. And oftentimes, you have like your introductory anecdote and paragraph, and then you hit, the teaching of history or someone else's argument, or looking at the data and information, and then you end with argument. So I always like to make sure that my papers begin and end with a pretty strong argument. They do a little bit of teaching near the start, and then in the middle, if they're more looking at evidence and things like that, that's what I go for. So I always go for that general arc.
That's a that's a great comment. And I mean, I know from both being a student and having my papers being graded, and from being a professor and grading papers, that an organized paper, an organized argument is often just going to hold together better. I'm sure that people out there have gotten the frustrating feedback, like needs better organization in red
Mm.
pen. What Cahill is saying is an enormous step towards achieving that, and it's pretty easy to do. You just sort of put the blue stuff in the blue box, right? Put the red stuff in the red box. You just make sure that your paragraphs contain what they're supposed to.
Yeah, and this can be really difficult if you feel like you don't have anything to add. But in that case, it's even more important to do it so that you move the summary away from what you've already been arguing. Chances are you have a bit of argument there. that once you kind of move the summary bits away, you'll be able to turn into a whole new paragraph or something.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. And so this next point is something that you and I both have in common. It was my last point and your first point, and
Yep.
that is print out the paper and read it out loud. You it's impossible to catch everything on a computer screen, especially these days when we're looking at them all the time and our eyes just glaze over. Print it out, maybe go to sleep, and then the next day read it out loud with a pen in your hand and change everything back to your own voice, how you would say something.
I could not agree more. Something I tell my students is that when they're initially composing the essay, I want them to be space age. Use every technology at their fingertips, write on an iPad, write on their phone, write on the computer, do whatever they need to do, right? They can dictate, I don't care. But when they edit, I want them to be a 19th century editor, right? I want them to have the manuscript, and I like when you think of the Spider-Man movies, there's always the really sort of grumpy, crotchety, or old world editor. I want them to be that. You want the manuscript in front of you, really discerning with a pen, and I guarantee you, you will catch things that you miss on the screen.
You're going to have a bunch of students yelling, "Get me Spider-Man." But it's true. And this is also applicable if you're doing a presentation or something like that. Have it printed out, edit it to your own voice so you kind of know how you want to say things anyway. I always make sure that my final papers come alongside a final presentation. And I want the paper, if it's going to, if people are going to talk about it or do some sort of presentation, I want it as close to the natural language as possible.
Great point.
I believe we're on your number 2 point then.
All right. And yeah, and I have three quick ones that I can give here. They're short, but I think they really are impactful. So the first thing I would say is that when you're reading your essay for the last time, don't be afraid to look for moments or add them in that are enjoyable, right? Where you're stylistic, where you're artful, where you're funny, right? Where you take a risk or you are clever, right? We've all read essays that are just they're a delight to read, and that's often because the author has command of tone. And if nothing else, think about your professor reading 15 similar essays, right? There's no way they won't appreciate you being aware of your tone, being clever, funny, ironic. So what I always do is I'll try to sprinkle in an essay afterwards. Just where are those humanistic moments that might make the reader pause or chuckle? That I think really go a long way.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine an essay as like a meal, right? And you don't want the same texture or same flavor throughout the whole thing. You want little bits of change in texture. You want like little moments of wit to spice things up. You want to be able to say, this is when we're hitting it hard, but here's where we're a little bit theoretical. Those changes in consistency keep a reader engaged. And yeah, it's fun.
Yep, yep. Um, my second point here has to do with what I think is often the weakest portion of students' essays, and often the portion where students might feel a bit lost, and that's the conclusion. And so something that I always do in my own essays is when I'm ready to hand it in, I'm doing the final read through, I'll make sure that in the conclusion that I'm not repeating myself, because very often we just like to deploy the thesis again.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'll get rid of repetition and I'll add like, why does this matter in the larger world? Right? And that's something that's a question you can write a couple sentences about for any topic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why should the reader care? Why does it matter in 2020? And it's just a way to end with a little bit of an uptick in relevance. And yeah, it's a quick move, but I feel like it's a good one.
Absolutely. The kind of like opening up to other avenues of thought, like showing that you're willing to have other people engage with it or push the idea further. I mean, that's great. I do believe that we should do a little bit of retracing our steps, in that we should like maybe just remind the reader where we've gone. If we talked about a certain chapter or like a certain thing, put those in there. But we're using those instead of as argument, as evidence. and
Yep.
the
Yep.
argument becomes something much bigger than that.
Yep. No, that's a great point. You do need elements of your key argument, your thesis in your conclusion, but you just don't want to repeat the same thing.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, you want to open it up to the larger world.
why it matters.
Um, yeah, exactly. And then my third point to close us out here just has to do with the title. I'm often surprised. Excuse me. I'm often surprised by my own students' reluctance to, again, like, be playful, be clever, be ironic, be bold in your title. Right. The paper begins at the title. It doesn't begin at paragraph one.
Absolutely.
Your arguments may begin in the title. And so really go back and make sure that your title, it relates to your paper, one, and two, that you work just as hard in your title and you're as intentional there as you are perhaps in the rest of your paragraphs.
Mm-hmm. And like, there's a whole art to titling. Some people love, punny, witty things, but sometimes that's maybe not the best feel for it. Some people, just put down the most broad strokes thing. And I actually think this kind of rolls back into understanding your key terms. If your key terms or something that is like foundational to your argument isn't in your title,
Yeah,
you're doing something wrong. You need to
that's a
pull
great
something
point.
in there. Do us the favor, summarize something at least a little bit in your title. If you want to be witty, maybe put that in like the top script and then a subscript. Give us something that's a more of a summary.
Yeah, well put. Yeah, I think that's a nice way to end this. Is that your key terms really should stand out in your paper, in the title and throughout.
Although, as a final note, so generally when I teach my first few essays in comp, I will come in one day with a one to 10 list, and it'll about half of them will be blank, and then another half of them will be like essay three, and maybe one or two will have titles. I generally don't tell my students to put titles on their essays because it's
Mm,
assumed.
yep.
And so there's like always this joke moment where they get a list with a couple of titles and a bunch of blank spaces, and they don't know what it is. You tell them it's the top 10
Yep.
titles from the last essay.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's just a quick reminder that has everyone kind of shaking their own heads at what they forgot. Any title is better than no title, unless it's like final essay.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Any title is better than no title. Yep.
All right. Well, with that, we'll close this one out. Good luck to anyone working on final papers right now. Hopefully, this helps you. And I think we'll close out this semester next week talking about grading and some of the ideas behind that.
Ooh,
Um,
great.
anyway, with that, have a good one, everyone.
See you. Bye bye.
Take care.